Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Gal, for inviting me, and thanks for putting this together. I think it's been a fascinating and very insightful day so far with, I thought, very good speeches. I also look at home. This is the Catholic University room, and my previous job was at the Catholic University in Leuven, so it feels a bit like being back. I'm a bit like, I'm preparing for this presentation, like I think what Bruce McCarroll said earlier. He said, well, I took the invite, and then when I was preparing, I said, what am I going to talk about? And I felt a little bit like that. So Gal asked me to talk about political economy without giving much specifics, and of course that's a whole bunch of potential things. I must say today, or these days, these years almost now, I'm involved in a lot of political economy, but I'm more the subject of it than the analyst looking in. So there's been several references today to underinvestments in agricultural R&D, and that's particularly at the CGIAR level, but obviously at IFPRI level, that's really what we are involved in the discussions, the negotiations, and the politics of these investments. Okay, so my talk will be more like a number of issues which I think are relevant looking forward, and I will also look back on a number of cases to see also the lessons that we learned in the past, what we can take forward on that. The issue is extremely relevant, I think that for certain. There's an interesting example, for example, what's happening right now in Holland and the Netherlands and the EU. So there's the person who has led the new EU Green Deal is a Dutch politician, Frans Timmermans, and he is rumored to maybe become the next prime minister of Holland. At the same time, the resistance against some of the policies in Holland have been extreme. There is now a new party created, it's called the BBB, the Boerenburgersbeweging, or the Farm Citizens Movement. So it's a new political party really focusing on farmers, which I would expect never would have happened in Europe anymore. And so and they're actually projected to win like a really significant share of the vote in the next election. So it is very hot, very actual, and of course this is just one example. There's many examples over the world. So let me just get going, and I will follow some of the, I think, Rich set it in motion, so basically marketing your own books going forward. So I'll do some of that as well. So I'll start with this one. This maybe triggered Gal to invite me. So this is a book in 2018 where we basically collected a lot of the research. It's really a research overview of the last 25 years on political economy, different issues. And so some of the key questions there where we worked on in the past, let's say 25 years, is really the big question. Remember, why were farmers subsidized in rich countries and taxed in poor countries? The puzzle, as we called it. But also underinvestment in research and development. There's quite a bit of work being done on that. The preference for inefficient policy instruments. Why do you use quotas? Why do you use tariffs and not direct subsidies, etc.? And also in terms of regulations and food standards and something driving the political forces behind that. There's been quite a number of things that have changed since then. I'm sorry. So this is a good story. So this is, if you look, this for the last 50 years roughly, the evolution of market distortions in the world, if you want, agricultural market distortions. And they were very large both in rich countries and in poor countries in most of the, let's say, since after the decades after World War II, okay, 70s, 80s, 90s. But since then, these distortions have reduced quite significantly, both in the developing countries where taxation of agriculture has really fallen. China, of course, plays an important role in that, but also in the developed countries where the subsidization of farm, there's still a lot of subsidies around, actually around $800 billion a year, but much less than they used to be some decades ago. The right panel shows this is more about the share of the most distortive subsidies. These are the red part of the column, and the share of less distortive policies, which is the green part. And you see there's been a very significant change in that from the 1980s really till today. So this is good news. So things can happen, can change for the better. This was not the right thing. Go back here. Okay. Sorry. Right. So this is another thing which has changed, and that's the growth of global food regulation, food standards which are affecting. And so that applies both to the private sector. So they have introduced a whole set of regulations, initially mostly around safety, but then gradually also affecting a lot of other factors. And also in the public arena, of course, a lot of, and so these have grown really almost exploded globally since really 1990, and particularly after 2000. I'll come back to that a bit later in the end, because I think this is going to have a major impact going forward on trade, and Tom Hurtle made a big case this morning that trade is going to be really important going forward. But if you're going to link sustainability standards to trade, I mean, that is potentially having a major impact on how trade will work. Now, if we look forward, then, so I've titled this From Agriculture Policy to Food Systems Transformation. And so this is a slide or a figure that we've used in an IFPRI report or in several IFPRI reports. And so this is really what we call the objectives of food system transformation. And it brings the reduction of market distortion and trade distortion, just one component. This is, if you want, the efficiency element there. But we're now looking at things like health. I mean, we just had two speakers talk about nutrition and access to healthy food. Clearly also the resilience issue. I mean, today several speakers talked about the level of prices, whether we're going to go up or down in the long run, but the volatility obviously is a huge issue. And of course with COVID, the resilience of supply chains and climate change, etc., is a really big thing. Inclusiveness refers to poverty, I mean, including the poorest, but also, for example, gender and social groups inclusion. And sustainability, that includes climate change, biodiversity, etc. So it's a much more complex thing we're involved in now. Okay, so there's more objectives, there's more policy instruments to deal with all these objectives, and they're going to interact. So that refers to the trade-offs, the synergies, etc. And we have many more actors involved. Okay, so we're dealing with a much more complex world in various dimensions, if you want. And I'll just reflect on a couple of these points. I think Tom, also in his presentation, he referred to the work that where David Silverman was involved in as well, did for the United Nations Food Systems Summit, where they looked at these various things, the Sustainable Development Goals, and looked at some of the trade-offs and the synergies there. And this is my second book at advertisement. This one comes out in 2 months, so this is about jointly edited with Daniel Resnick of the Brookings Institution, where we brought together a number of people writing on various aspects of this. We actually have a session at this conference on Monday, I think, where some of these chapters will be presented. Okay, now let me go illustrate a couple of these things. That's all I will do, probably point out things mostly. This is work which is being done mostly at IFPRI, but also together with our colleagues in the World Bank and FAO, where they have tried to integrate our traditional models, where we looked at prices, farm incomes, etc., and basically integrate things like looking at diets, so on nutrition, an indicator, impact on biodiversity, impact on greenhouse gas emissions, etc., in these models. So the models have become much more complicated, targeting much more outcome indicators, if you want. And so here, this is as part of our what's called the repurposing work, so the idea of agricultural subsidy reform, how it's affecting all these different outcome dimensions. And as you can, so these are 3 different scenarios. One is removal of all the support. Second is targeting the support to CO2 efficient crops. And then the third one is repurposing towards sustainable innovation. So this is basically taking some of the support away and targeting it, giving it to R&D, but defined in very broad sense, not just new, new technological innovation, but also helping people to get access to the technology innovations that exist but are not used right now. And you see these indicators, these scenarios show that this third scenario is by far the best in a number of these indicators. And of course, the distributional effects across the world as well, who benefits more, etc. But just to give you an example of the type of work that is currently going on, but it's very complicated. A second set of work that's going on has to do with what I call policy interactions. This is a report from a large group which is led or co-led by Chris Barrett at Cornell. So Chris is first author. There's, I think, about 25 authors on there, and it's referred to social technical innovation bundles for agri-food systems transformation. So it's really about the bundling. So you should not focus on one particular policy, you should focus on a set of policies. Now, the point there is that you can see this in different ways. So you, for example, if you have a new technology, but farmers don't have access to credit, there's too much risk and there's no insurance mechanism, you need to have complementary policy bundles to make these things work. That's really it. Another element there is that Chris and his co-authors are arguing, this is also good because there's distributional effects among different groups. Some benefit, some lose from these different policies. And so if you have more bundles, if you have more policies, then the losses and the gains will be distributed differently. So in the package will be better for you as a whole, so you have much less losers going forward, and therefore the package as a whole is better than the individuals of making this work. The issue there, I think, is there's a lot of, it really depends on the type of policies you're talking about, and so there's a lot of uncertainty, obviously, from different interest groups. We'll see, well, how is this going to affect me? And if I just look at the model we were just running in terms of how it's affecting all these different dimensions, so people have to basically do these calculations for themselves to take a position on this going forward. And so this means there's uncertainty related to the design. People, let's say, we want to set up the optimal bundle, but of course also how people will react to it if there is uncertainty, how these different impacts will play out. There is some examples of this in history, if you want, and this is work that we have done before, so this goes back. This is the work where people like Julian Alston, Harry de Gorter, etc., I think David has been involved and some colleagues in Berkeley, on how agricultural research and innovation investments, how they are interacting with subsidies, okay? And so basically there initially the idea was you have to stop the subsidies and move it into R&D, which is in a way also what our repurposing work is saying, right? Stop with the subsidies and move it there. It's more efficient, better for everybody. What we see historically, and this is very different types of data, it's a century for Belgium and it's about 25 years for China. And so over this period what you see is that these things go together. Okay, and so this is, if you want, political economy outcomes. That's what the government actually have done. So they haven't traded off less subsidies and more in R&D. Instead, they've increased R&D and increased the subsidies at the same time. Okay, so if you bring in this political economy dimension, it may actually be work different than if you just look at the bundling, if you want. And one of the reasons for this is, of course, that in this case, if you look at the interaction between both policies, there's an economic component and there's a political component. The economic component is that the distribution of the benefits, so on the left-hand side, that's if you have only R&D, you see you have distribution between the farmer's effect and the income effect and the consumer's income effect, and depending on the elasticity of the demand curve, farmers will benefit more or less. If you introduce, in this case, like a fixed price farm support, all the benefits of the R&D go to the farmers. So it's very different, you see. And then, of course, but at the same time, this basically the supply curve shifting out because of R&D will increase the distortions of this policy, of the farm subsidy policy. So all these things work. So this means, just to illustrate, these things are complex, and the economics and the politics really are both very important components of the same question, I think. All right, let me then move to some of the different agents that are participating. And I've had, so I'm going to take a bit of a value chain perspective here. So I've done a lot of work on value chains in the past, but on the economic side, but I think there's also a very important political component on value chains. And so typical when in many of our models we talk about producers, consumers, and taxpayers, okay, the policy world, on subsidies, etc. But who are the producers and who are the consumers? Well, most of the farmers don't sell their products, except in some farmers market directly to the households. They sell them to traders, to processors, to retailers, whatever. Okay, so their consumers are actually these companies. Vice versa, so if the households are going to buy their food, they don't buy it directly from the farmers mostly, they buy it from the retailers or from the traders or whatever. So if you bring in these elements in these components, and typically what you see is that the social organization, the economic organization of these different actors in the value chains are very different. So we think often, remember the old Olsonian story that farmers cannot organize themselves. There's too many of them and they're too fragmented. Well, there's not too many retailers and they're not too fragmented, right? Well, they are in some cases, but still, the structure is different, and that, of course, affects the political economy dimensions. So in many cases, what you see that in around specific policies, you get coalitions along the value chains. For example, if milk is exported or a dairy product, typically it's not the fresh milk that's exported, it's cheese or yogurt or whatever. So that means that the processor is probably, if it's an import tariff, on the side of the farmer. But it could be different ways depending on the type of the product that is being affected and the type of the policy that is being introduced. I can go through this. I have a whole set of examples if you want on this, but I'll just go through a couple of other examples here, and I'm sure you know many of the examples yourself. This is a case which was very interesting. I thought this was very recently, prior to COVID recently, where there was a discussion on unfair trading practices in value chains. And so the European Farmers Association submitted a complaint against retailers that retailers were basically treating them unfairly through all kinds of contract renegotiations and then things like that, and thereby reaping the benefits through the value chains. Okay? And so they wanted the European governments to intervene and to regulate this thing. So the retailers obviously opposed, and initially the food processors sided with the retailers. So it looked like there was not going to be much regulation coming out. Until the food processors looked at themselves, and then they realized that 80% of the food processors in Europe were small and medium enterprises who were getting the same treatment as the farmers. So they switched alliances and sided with the farmers, and so we have very significant regulations now coming out of that because of this switch. Here's another example. So the overall point I'm making here actually is going forward, if we want to have important policy changes happening, okay, we have to think about complex coalitions and actually often out-of-the-box thinking in terms of making this work. So I'm going to give an example of that from basically with a century and a half difference. One is from the end of the 19th century. And so then basically there's a lot of new grain coming in actually from the Baltic areas into the European markets, and there's a lot of pressure to introduce import tariffs. And so you see two groups of countries. You see Britain and France really, France and Germany introducing import tariffs, really protectionist responses, and for example, the UK and Belgium not. And the reason why is because there is an anti-protectionist coalition from quite a complex and different types of groups. It includes workers, industrial capital, the transport industry, the coal mines, the brewing industry, the harbors, the livestock farmers. So they all side, okay? And so the coalition of that blocks it in the more industrialized countries of UK and Belgium. Here's a much more different question, but much more recently. So this is a story from the Washington Post from, I think, 2 years ago. Veggie burgers were living in idyllic little existence, and then they got caught in a war over the future of meat. And so in the article, it's a fascinating article, it describes the coalitions on both sides of the case. And so on the one hand, you have the ranchers with the traditional meat industry behind them, but on the other hand, you don't have the, let's say, the veggie lovers, but it's really a much more complex group. It includes, for example, Beyond Meat, which has Wall Street investors with them, retailers and restaurants, which have really invested in, also some of the large retailers, which see this as basically a profitable part of their sales. And then the major meat processors, Tyson Foods and Smithfields, they stay out because they have interest on both sides and they want to see how this plays out before things. So again, a very complex story, if you want, or coalition coming together around these things. So this is my last slide on this. And this is from actually just a couple of weeks ago. This is from the Belgian newspaper. And so Tony Chocolonely is one of the ethnic and fair trade brand, which has grown a lot, actually. You can get it in the US. I've seen it in several supermarkets. It started off as a very small alternative chocolate producer in Holland. And so now, basically, who is taking a control stake in it? It's ABI. It's your Bud Light producers. I mean, they have bigger trouble here than at home, but still, I mean, it's where big and small in the most extreme form actually come together. And again, also, again, a very unusual group going forward. How am I doing in terms of time? Okay, great. Then I have actually 2 points more. One is on policy persistence and the other one is on information. And so on policy persistence, I gave my fellows address to the association a couple of years ago exactly on this thing. And so it was referred to several times today. I think also Bruce made the point you need a big disaster in terms of getting out of this. And so that's it depends a bit on the type of policies, but on a lot of the regulation, particularly the major regulations, for example, what you get is you have policy persistency, and that has to do with the dynamic nature of it. So once you introduce a policy, even if it's just borderline passed by 51% of the votes or something, things change after the introduction of the regulation. And that's because you get investments by companies, but also by retailers, whomever is involved, okay, to organize their operations along the regulations, okay, or consistent with the regulations. And that will change comparative advantage in the dynamic sense. And that means that for removing this regulation, it may take a much larger majority to get rid of it. And that's what we see. We see some of these regulations persist for 10s, 20s, hundreds of years, even before they can actually be removed because of these rules. And you see there's a number of cases which we've discussed where, for example, some regulations were introduced to protect consumer safety regulations, for example, which later were used by producer organizations to protect their markets against foreign other producers, okay? And so this is what I mean by regulations that were introduced for good reasons may persist for bad reasons. And so therefore, a shock to the system, and that can be, climate change can be a shock, but also, for example, international integration can be a shock. It can lead to changes, but you need something like that, probably. And then my last point has to do with the political economy of information. It's something that almost everybody I talk to think is very important, but there's actually not that much research being done on it. So Jill McCluskey and I did some work on it. It's almost 20 years ago now that we started. It makes me feel old, but it hasn't really gotten much traction going forward. But you see that most of the information that people consume, where they put their information on, is coming not from scientific papers or scientific communication, but it goes through initially through mass media, and now increasingly to social media. About 40% in 2020 of US adults got their information on these things from Facebook alone. That's just massive. And then what people do, that's what psychological literature or studies show, is that they discount the information depending on the source, but they only discount partially. Okay? So that means it is still the bias remains in people's behavior, not, let's say, 100%, but certainly to some extent. An issue which has received quite a lot of attention, particularly with social media right now, has to do with what I call echo chambers. So basically, people select the type of information which is consistent with how they view the world, or the information channels, okay, which ideologically fit. And that means people only talk to other people who think the same. And that leads or contributes to global polarization in the world going forward, and particularly on some issues we are talking about here today, climate change, GMOs, etc. This is really very important. And so the point that Jill and I have made is that rational ignorance, which was initially based on information cost of the media, is continuing because of two things. One is the opportunity cost, because you're flooded with it. You can also have too much information just to sort out which one you want to consume. And the second one is with the ideological component, that you don't want to read information from sources you don't like for other reasons. This is I think maybe some of you, or many of you may have seen this. This is a study which shows that, well, the title summarizes it well. Extreme opponents of genetically modified foods know the least, but think they know the most, and they talk to each other. And this is my final slide here. I just put this in because I think it's such an incredible story, and it fits with the rational ignorant hypothesis that we have. This is a story from the New York Times of a person who, after Trump got elected, and he obviously didn't like Trump, said, I don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. He stopped reading the news. And so they called him. He has managed to become shockingly uninformed, and today he is as ignorant as any contemporary citizens could ever hope to be. So that's the extreme version of the thing. Anyhow, that's it. the after lunch.
You started off talking about the Green Deal in Europe, and so there a lot of the tension was not with DG Agri promoting that Green Deal, but it was two other directorates, Environment and Health, trying to impose something on agriculture. So what about that political economy of internal to the decision-making apparatus? How do you see that fitting into your framework?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. In a way, if you think back to the figure I showed with the 5 different objectives, traditionally they have been separated, or in many cases. You had the Ministry of Health, you had the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Social Development, etc. And now when you think about this food system transformation, they have to come together. And that also means that institutionally somehow they have to be brought together. And the fact that the impact of the food system, it depends a bit the role of agriculture itself, but which is very significant, which studies now show, on climate change, on greenhouse gas emission, means that if you want to have a coherent overall strategy on climate change, that you have to bring agriculture into it. And of course, then the issue is the hierarchy of the decision making there. And so there's been certainly I mean, the vote got through just, I think, 10 days ago or so, and it was very tight, okay? Because until the last moment that was a sub-item of the Green Deal. But it's been highly contested for exactly that reason, that basically it's the trade-off of these different objectives that you have and how to deal with it. And so the way that the agricultural policy part of the Green Deal, if you want, is moving in the next phase is the targets are set at European level, but the implementation is now going to the national levels, okay? And so there will have to be national programs which have to fit these targets. And that, of course, adds another layer of complexity, because you not only have these horizontal things where there's trade-offs, or basically political fights or domain fights, if you want, but also in the level of the vertical level in terms of the decision-making. It's equivalent to the states here and the federal government, I'd say. And that's also why in Holland it's a big fight and a very important one, because there's a lot of intensive livestock industry in other European countries around there. Same thing in Belgium, and the same thing will come up there. Yeah. Okay.